Hello my friends, allow me to introduce you to the lion at Gripsholm Castle. This stunning example of taxidermical excellence can be found 60 kilometers, about 37 miles, west of Stockholm, Sweden. Now there are quite a number of myths surrounding this lion, to the point that no English language source that I could find has an accurate story of how it came to be. Although there are a few stories regarding King Frederick I and the two lions were given by Algeria in the early 1730s, as part of a treaty to grant Swedish ships protection from the Barbary pirates of the North African coast. But when you look deeper into it, that story falls apart. In fact, the story of this lion has become such a mess over the years, I had to ask for help in finding and translating reliable Swedish news articles about it. I'd like to take this moment to thank Edgar Arendt for that. You can check out a link to his Minds account in the description, along with a translation that he did for me of one of the news articles, along with a list of the other references used in this video. On top of that, I also took the time to contact the curators of Gripsholm Castle itself in order to verify the story. As you can see in the screenshot here, the exact details of the lion's origin are unknown. After researching what was supposed to be a bit of a throwaway joke, I found that the reporting of the story in English language media has been so disappointing. I'm actually going to make an entirely separate short video with details on it once I've finished with this subject. I'm already about halfway done with the script for it. While we may not know with certainty where this lion came from, we know enough to speculate. Gathering together what we do know, the most likely timeline for this lion is fairly straightforward. Likely sometime in the early 1700s. The lion was given to a member of the royal family. Its remains were then given to a taxidermist who was unfamiliar with the way living lions looked in nature. Not many lions in 18th century Northern Europe, after all. The taxidermist was, however, familiar with the classic heraldic symbol of the passant lion, proudly raising one of its front paws, tongue out in a mighty roar. And frankly, if you observe the lion from the side, it doesn't look nearly as bad as from the front. All facts considered, for an attempt by someone who had in all likelihood only seen lions on royal crests and the like, it's not nearly as bad as it could have been. Despite its goofiness, it's pretty impressive that an 18th century taxidermist was able to create a close enough likeness that we can instantly recognize it as a lion today. When presented with the pelt of the lion, the taxidermist would have had to reconstruct the lion's posture, eyes, tongue, and look at the mouth, possibly teeth. To do so, he would have been forced to rely on any information available to him at the time, using literature to living animals that were observable to him. This is not too dissimilar to the way naturalists of the next century would have to reconstruct newly discovered fossils that would become known as dinosaurs. Dinosaurs have been closely linked to the concept of evolution in the public eye for years. Even prior to Darwin's publishing of his On the Origin of Species, dinosaurs had managed to capture the public's imagination of a bygone era when the terrible lizards themselves ruled the earth. In 1824, Megalosaurus, Latin for great lizard, was the first dinosaur to be identified by William Buckland, an eccentric fellow who had a pet bear he'd often bring to college functions at Oxford University. The next year, Gideon Mantell, a doctor who collected fossils as a hobby, published his work about Iguanodon, Latin for iguana tooth, and 8 years later identified Haliosaurus, Latin for woodland lizard. It would be several years later, in 1841, when British naturalist Richard Owen would establish the taxon Dinosauria using the 3 previously identified species. While Buckland and Mantell pictured dinosaurs as larger versions of today's sprawling postured reptiles crawling low to the ground, Owen reimagined them as more mammal-like, standing with an erect posture and possessing a circulatory system similar to what would be described as warm-blooded today. Due to the efforts of Owen, the sculptures of London's Crystal Palace Park were unveiled to the public in 1854. These sculptures depicted the scientific consensus at the time that the first discovered dinosaurs, Megalosaurus and Iguanodon, were large, slow, four-legged creatures that looked like modern reptiles, only with erect posture. This was in large part due to the fact that there was simply no adequate animal analog that the naturalists of the day were aware of to use as a basis to model these novel creatures' anatomy. There was no extensively constructed fossil record to provide an appropriate starting point. As such, early attempts at skeletal reconstruction used animals such as iguanas as a starting point, and as you can see from the images being shown, the results ultimately left much to be desired. 2 decades later, in 1878, the complete fossilized skeletons of 38 iguanodons were discovered in Belgium. Once scientists could see the complete remains, a few mistaken assumptions became obvious. The supposed nose horn was actually a thumb claw. The forelimbs were clearly shorter than the hind limbs, and subsequently, the entire animal's posture no longer made sense as was depicted in the Crystal Palace sculptures. Unfortunately, since this was the first discovery of complete dinosaur fossils, there was still nothing in the record to provide a comparison, let alone a proper starting point to model anatomy. This led scientists to use wallabies and cassowaries as guides for their reconstruction. This resulted in a new depiction that would define dinosaurs from the late 1870s all the way to the late 1960s, which would be the beginning of the so-called dinosaur renaissance. Dinosaurs were now slow, bipedal, lumbering behemoths that dragged their tails behind them. This cultural depiction would remain so strong that it would even be the image of dinosaurs that would serve as a large basis for the design of Godzilla in 1954. The scientific view of dinosaurs would undergo another revolution due to the advent of the dinosaur renaissance. The Renaissance began with the 1964 discovery of Deinonychus by John Ostrom and his doctoral student Robert Baker. Baker's subsequent sketching of Deinonychus in dynamic poses with bird-like musculature as opposed to the usual reptilian muscle structures, in addition to his work with Ostrom, would fuel a new flurry of research into dinosaurs that continues to this day. In the words of Dr. Darren Nash, the dinosaur renaissance saw the flabby-bodied, tail-dragging behemoths of earlier decades replaced by sprightly, athletic animals with big bulging limb muscles, erect tails, and dashing patterns and color schemes. In the process, dinosaurs were transformed from slow, lumbering giants into highly diverse, dynamic creatures that can range from the giant sauropods to the smaller but extremely agile dromaeosaurs, which include the velociraptor, who were a family of theropods, the suborder whose members would eventually evolve into birds. Baker's interpretation of dinosaur physiology was accepted and advanced by many prominent paleoartists of the time. This includes Greg Paul, whose visualizations would serve as the basis for most of the depictions of not only other artists, but of Jurassic Park, which helped shape the public's perception of dinosaurs drastically. Also, sorry about ruining them for you, but for anyone who is unaware, the raptors in Jurassic Park are more roughly based on Deinonychus, although they more closely match Utahraptor, which was discovered shortly after the design of Jurassic Park's raptors was conceived. Robert Baker's book, Raptor Red, recounts an anecdote from his time consulting on Jurassic Park. "Jim," I yelled. Jim being Dr. James Kirkland, one of the team who discovered Utahraptor. "You just discovered the giant raptor that Spielberg made up for his movie." Jim thought it was a daft. He didn't know about the other phone call I'd gotten about giant raptors that morning. It was from one of the special effects artists in the Jurassic Park skunkworks. The artists were suffering anxiety about what was to become the star of the movie, a raptor species that had never been documented by a real fossil. Just before Jim called, I'd listened to one artist complain that Spielberg had invented a raptor that didn't exist. He wanted hard facts, fossil data. "Yeah, a giant raptor is possible theoretically, but you don't have any bones." But now Jim's Utah raptor gave him bones. It's a good book, I recommend you give it a read. As an aside, I personally think Velociraptor looked a bit more like a demonic chicken than a movie monster. While we're on that train of thought, it should be noted that the evidence of the connection between birds and reptiles appeared a century before the dinosaur renaissance. The discoveries of Archaeopteryx in 1861 and the toothed birds Ichthyornis dispar and Hesperornis regalis in 1872 showed reptilian birds developing into numerous forms. Darwin's bulldog himself, Thomas Henry Huxley, would even use Archaeopteryx as an example in the evolutionary connection between birds and reptiles.